right, welcome everybody to Scripture Night. And today's presentation is called The Watchmen Are Out of Business. And yes, indeed, my good brothers and sisters, we're going to dig right back into Luke chapter 21 to further prove that everything that Jesus said in the first century happened by 70 AD. And the intention of this presentation is to move you out of fear, the fear of the end of the world type of scenario, and into the greatest commandment, loving others as self. And yes, indeed, we are going to put those watchmen and watchwomen out of business so that they too can pour themselves into the greatest commandment and into Galatians 6:2, the law of Christ. Bear ye one another's burdens. So, let's go dig into the Scriptures. All right, here we are in Luke chapter 21. And I like to remind everybody before we get going that we do have a YouTube membership here. You click on join. There are 3 tiers. The lowest tier is for $2.99 and you can cancel at any time. But of course, only if you can afford it and you are so inclined to support the ministry. All right, so let's remind ourselves, my good brothers and sisters, that there was an actual temple standing in the first century, and it was adorned with those goodly stones and gifts. There's no such temple today. And then, of course, Jesus tells them that there would not be left one stone upon another that wouldn't be thrown down. In other words, he's saying it was going to be destroyed. And that's what brings about this conversation where they ask about when it would happen and what the signs would be. So we talked about how that generation would see the fulfillment of that destruction. And of course, we know that in 70 AD, the temple in Jerusalem was completely destroyed by the Roman armies. All right, so we talked about the signs in the last video, and I would recommend that you watch End Times in Disneyland because we cover, essentially verses 5 all the way down to about 16 and 17. Now, I am going to come back in another presentation to cover verses 18 and 19, but I think we better understand those verses by coming back to it. All right, so we will cover them, but for this presentation, we're going to cover primarily verses 20 to 23, because it sets it in the first century and it sets the location. All right. So it says here in the text that Jesus says to them, when you see Jerusalem compassed with armies. It's a specific location that would be compassed with armies. And we indeed know that it was the Roman armies that surrounded Jerusalem in and around 66 AD. And that was the beginning of the really major part of the Roman-Jewish war. So, for example, what I would do to move you out of any kind of frightful thoughts is this. Do you live in Jerusalem, for example? If you don't, you have nothing to fear. Do you see that? Because this is not an event that's happening in the entire world. It's happening specifically in Jerusalem. And he continues and he says, know that the desolation thereof is near. So when he says, know that this desolation is coming around really soon, he's basically saying when Jerusalem gets surrounded by the Roman armies, you will know that the desolation thereof is near. Well, what desolation, my good brothers and sisters, is he talking about? Well, what ignited the conversation in the first place? The destruction of the temple that was standing in and around 30 AD that would end up being completely destroyed by 70 AD. All right? That's the desolation that he is speaking of. So now you've got the timeline there, you've got the location, and you recognize that it's an historic event. So nothing for you to fear. No need for the watchmen and the watchwomen. Then let them which are in Judea flee to the mountains. All right, so are you in Judea? See, let's be practical with this. Are you in Judea? Because if you're not, well, then you don't have to flee to the mountains because you're not there. Do you see what I'm saying here? This can help you see the text for what it says. We'll continue. And let them which are in the midst of it depart out. So, once again, he's saying if you're in the midst of Judea. If you're in Jerusalem, then get out of there. And you're not in Jerusalem and you're not in Judea, you don't have to flee to the mountains because you're not there. And you can see the text for what it actually says in its historic context. And the other good news here is if they can flee to the mountains for some kind of safety, that's further evidence that this is not a worldwide event that Jesus is speaking of. And then he says this, and let not them that are in the countries enter in. So what's Jesus' advice? If you're outside of Jerusalem and you're outside of Judea, don't come in. Because all of this destruction is happening there in Jerusalem. And then you can really see the text for a first century context. No need to allow the watchmen and watchwomen to bring you into fear. And then, of course, Jesus continues. But before we go to verse 22, I want to say this, because some folks have asked me, well, what is he talking about? Who would be coming into the Jerusalem location? We have to remember, folks, that under the law of Moses, anybody who was an Israelite under that law had to come in for the feasts by law. They were bound by that law to come in for the feasts regularly. And let's not forget that Jerusalem was the religious capital of the world at that time. And this temple is the mothership of all temples. So lots of people other than Israelites would come to that location. It drew in a lot of people. And Jesus is saying, don't go. That's why. All right. And let's keep in mind, a lot of Israelites were scattered over the decades and the centuries. So they didn't all live in Jerusalem. So they'd have to come in for the feast. That's why Jesus is saying that, for their safety. Let's continue. For these be the days of vengeance. And he's talking about those days of vengeance being in that time frame, in that generation, and in that location. Those were the days of vengeance that Jesus is talking about. So you can rest easy that all things, and this is a very inconvenient sentence here for anyone in the futurist position, that all things which are written may be fulfilled. A little side note, I can't help but notice that many full preterists here say that all actually does mean all. But I digress. So he said all things that are written may be fulfilled based on that destruction that would be in Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. That's what the days of vengeance are that Jesus is speaking of. And when he says all things which are written may be fulfilled, he's talking about anything and everything in the Old Testament. And yes, that would include Jubilees. It would include Enoch. It would include Isaiah. It would include all Old Testament writings, because he said all things which are written may be fulfilled in those days of vengeance. And it was all centered in the first century, within that generation, in that Jerusalem back then, when the Roman armies surrounded Jerusalem and destroyed Israel, Jerusalem, in the ancient times. That's all things that are written. Now, a little side note. I fully acknowledge for partial preterists and little seasoned saints, I understand that that wouldn't technically cover the book of Revelation. And I understand that. That said, it would cover everything in the Old Testament, and I do see partial preterists and sometimes little seasoned saints using Old Testament scriptures to support their positions. So I would have to say, well, you can use it. This is just my suggestion. You can use it for pattern, but that's about it. You'd have to use it very thinly. It would be on thin ice. Why? Well, because all things that are written in the Old Testament are fulfilled in that destruction. Therefore, to use the Old Testament, other than for some pattern potentially, other than that, you really can't use it. That said, I don't think anyone can dodge the fact that he says all things that are written, whether you're a futurist, partial preterist, little seasoned saint, anything in the Old Testament is really out of bounds for any kind of repetition. And that's the other thing I want to mention. My good brothers and sisters, have you seen anything here that suggests that there's a dual fulfillment? Does he say that, the Jerusalem armies are going to compass and then they're going to do it again? Or that the desolation is going to happen, then it's going to happen again? And so you flee to the mountains, but then you can come back and then you're going to do it again? See, my good brothers and sisters, it's just not here. And so what they've done is convinced you that there's got to be a dual fulfillment, but it's not in the text. And it's based on this idea of some kind of rebuild, and that's why they're watching for the end of the world. So, one more time. All things. Does all mean all? That's the decision you have to make. And if it's all things, that includes any Old Testament writing for sure. All right? So let's go to the next line here where he says this. But woe unto them that are with child. I have to ask the question. Why? What's the difference? Shouldn't it say, but woe unto all of them that exist in the world? If it's going to be an absolute destruction of the entire world? Of course, it should say that if that was the case, but it's not. It's about the destruction of Israel, Jerusalem, and the temple in the first century. And therefore, the watchmen and the watchwomen are out of business. And of course, he continues and he says, those who give suck in those days, which basically is breastfeeding, right? So woe unto them with children and woe unto them that are breastfeeding. Why? My good brothers and sisters, I would suggest it's because it's difficult to flee into the mountains when you have to do that. Do you see what I'm saying? And because when you have a family, it's hard to take care of them in the mountains, and then people are less inclined to do that. So there's more of an inclination that they would stay in and around the cities and Jerusalem. And of course, a lot of bad things could happen to those families if they didn't get out of Jerusalem. That's why he says you got to get out of there. Now that would make sense, you see, but it's not a worldwide event. And he says, in those days, there's specific days that this specific group is going to be extra problematic for. Do you see? And that's further proof that it's not a worldwide event. And he makes it very clear, for there shall be great distress where? In the land, not in the entire world. The watchmen and the watchwomen are out of business. Why? Because this already happened in 70 AD. It was about Jerusalem, ancient Jerusalem, and the destruction of that temple. That's why it's great distress in that land, the land that he's been talking about the entire time, ancient Jerusalem. And then he specifies here, and he says, and wrath upon this people, a specific people group. It would have had to have been the people that were in what? That generation. Therefore, this also authenticates my position that the wrath that is being talked about in the Bible is the Roman-Jewish war. The wrath of God, the recompense of all that ill behavior in the first century is the wrath of God is the Roman-Jewish war. And that's why if you go to Matthew 3:7, I believe John the Baptist says to the Pharisees and the Sadducees, what does he say? He says, who has warned you to flee from the wrath to come? What wrath is he talking about? This wrath that was in that land back in the first century in Jerusalem when the Roman-Jewish war began because of all the civil unrest that was happening, and it started in and around 66 AD. It's a wrath that's upon a specific people group in the first century and in a specific land in the first century, which would have been in ancient Jerusalem when the temple was destroyed. Now, I'm going to take this opportunity to further affirm that Paul authenticates all of this is beginning to happen, and it's starting to ramp up in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. So, starting in verse 25, this is what Paul says. Now, concerning virgins, I have no commandment of the Lord. Now, a little side note. He's about to tell them something of his own discernment. So, as much as I can appreciate people saying that every word in the Bible is important, I would say, yes, that's true, including the words where Paul is basically saying, look, this is not a commandment from the Lord. So in other words, he's giving them his own advice and his own thoughts according to the scenario. See what happens when people say, well, every word is God-breathed. Okay, well, in this particular case, Paul is going out of his way to say, look, these are my thoughts. This is my judgment. So therefore, this is not intended to be an infinite piece of advice. We're going to talk more about that as we move forward. He's saying it himself. This is not a commandment of the Lord. All right? And he says, yet I'm going to give my judgment. I'm going to give you my advice as one that hath obtained mercy of the Lord to be faithful. So he's going to give him some advice that is not directly from the Lord. He says it himself. And he says, I suppose, therefore, that this is good for the what? The present distress. What? Present distress. Oh, might he be talking about that sign, the signs that were going to start to happen because of everything that he said was going to start to happen between verses 8 and 16? I'm going to suggest the answer is yes, because what does Jesus say in 23? There will be great distress in the land, in that area, right? So they're already starting to feel the rumbles of this. And 1 Corinthians was written in and around, they talk about around 55 to 57 AD. So they're only about 10 years away from the worst war. Now, let's go back here, because you're going to find out as we move forward, folks, that if you don't put this section in its own time context, this is going to be a very confusing text. And I think a lot of people have confused it, and they've used it wrongly because they don't acknowledge right out the gate that he says, I don't have a commandment of the Lord, but let me give you my advice based on the present distress. Do you see? So that's a very present tense letter with present tense advice. This is not an infinite instruction. Very important to catch that. These are letters. We have to remember that. They're letters that were written to certain people at a certain time. That's what we call as audience relevance. That's how you're supposed to try to discern the text. You have to keep the people in mind and the culture in mind and the occasions in mind at the time that the letter was being written. So he says that it is good for a man so to be. Art thou bound unto a wife? Seek not to be loosed. Oh, you married? Okay, stay married. Are you loosed from a wife? Don't seek a wife. Huh? What? Why not? Why can't I seek a wife, Paul? You're going to see. It's because of that present distress. You see? It would be like you giving someone advice in and around 1913, right? You're feeling like a war might be, they're talking about a war coming around. Someone might say, well, then this might not be a great time for you to get married. Do you see? Woe to them who have children in those days and are giving suck in those days. And you're going to see that Paul is affirming that you might want to think twice or three times before you make that move. It's not permanent instruction. It's an instruction for the present distress. Then he says, and if thou marry, you haven't sinned. And if a virgin marry, she hath not sinned. Well, gee, thanks, Paul. You mean we're allowed to get married? Do you see how that won't make sense if you try to make it an infinite instruction? That doesn't make any sense at all. But it does if you think of it in the sense of the present distress, right? He's saying, look, it's not wrong to get married, but what does he say here? He says, nevertheless, such shall have trouble in the flesh. See? Woe unto them who give suck in those days. Woe unto them with child, because you have to flee to the mountains, and then you may not be inclined to do so, for example, right? And he's saying in the flesh, you're going to have trouble. Little side note, does Paul care whether or not they are physically delivered from that war? I'm going to suggest the answer is yes. Does Jesus care? I mean, he must care. Otherwise, why did he tell them to flee into the mountains? Of course he cares. He wants them to survive. He does. That's why he gave those prophecies, and that's why he's giving that advice, and that's why Paul is giving this advice here. You're not doing anything wrong by getting married, but you might have to keep in mind that you're going to have some trouble in the flesh. And that's why he says, but I spare you. See? So what he's trying to say is, I'd like to spare you of those issues. But this I say, brethren, the time is short. So, assuming they're even accurate, but for all we know, this could have been written a little later, but let's say it's around 56, 57 AD. He's like, look, we're running out of time. That war is going to start in around 66 AD. I don't know that he knows for sure exactly when that it starts, but he knows that it's around the corner. That's why he said the time is short. That's why he says what he's about to say. It remains that both they that have wives be as though they had none. Wow. Wow. Do you see if you put that in today's context and you try to really go up to my wife and tell her, oh, by the way, say in front of her, say, by the way, Shade, I know you have a wife, but just pretend you don't have one. Wow. Oh, you're going to have some trouble there. I'll tell you right now. Just pretend you don't have a wife, Shade. Just pretend. Don't worry about it. No. That's not a good idea. And why? You'd only be quoting scripture. Right. But you'd be quoting a scripture where he said, I don't have a commandment of the Lord, but I'm going to give you my judgment based on the present distress. Do you see? This is not an instruction for infinity. You see? See what happens when you don't put audience relevance into the mix? You can really send people in the wrong direction if you don't include the culture and what was happening in the time in your understanding of the text. All right? So, this is not permanent advice, clearly. And they that weep as though they weep not, and they that rejoice as though they rejoice not, and they that buy as though they possess not. So for example, you think it's a good idea because, Jerusalem's got a lot of tourism going on back then. Hey, you want to buy a property and maybe you can rent it out and make a few bucks? Not a good idea. Why? Because the whole place is going to get destroyed. You wouldn't have said that potentially if you existed in 20 AD. You see? But Paul is saying, hey, act as if you don't possess anything. Do you see? Why? Because he just told them the time is short. This destruction is going to be huge, my good brothers and sisters. Huge. So he's saying the time is so short that if you're married, stay married. If you're not married, don't get married. That's what he's saying. Oh, do you own something? All right, but as if you don't own it because the time is short. Do you see how it'll make sense now? We'll continue. And they that use this world as not abusing it, for the fashion of this world is passing away. Now, what does he mean by that? Folks, he's not saying the entire world is going up in smoke. He's talking about a present distress, and he's talking about how the world is operating and how it's moving day to day, week to week, month to month, year to year. That's all going to be done real soon. The time is short. And so you might as well act as if you don't possess anything because everything's going to get really shaken up over the next little bit. He's not talking about the entire world passing away in any kind of literal sense. See, use this world. He's not talking about the turtles and the trees and the ducks and things of this nature. He's talking about how the world operates. And we can use this term that way. So for example, if you were to ever say, I think the world has gone mad, you're not talking about the turtles and the trees. You're just talking about how things are operating in the world, how it's functioning. And he's saying the fashion of this world, how it's functioning, is coming to an end. All right, so we'll continue. But I would have you without carefulness. And I know that there's a lot of people that really like the Old King James, but you have to get to know the Old English. What he means is without anxiety. I don't want you to be in anxiousness. Do you see that? That's what he means. He that is unmarried careth for the things that belong to the Lord. So he says when you remain free, you can walk in the ways of Christ more freely and you can be a little more agile in how you operate, how he may please the Lord. Whereas if you get married, that's going to be a lot more difficult to do. That's why he says in verse 33, but he that is married cares for the things that are of the world, how he might please his wife. So this is not an insult, and it's not wrong to do it. He's just saying, look, if you get married now, well, then you're going to actually have to care about what's happening day to day, week to week, month to month on a major level because you want to please your wife. That's why he's saying this. I've seen these texts be completely misused based on a futurist thinking. We'll continue. Verse 34, there is a difference also between a wife and a virgin. The unmarried woman cares for the things of the Lord. So again, women, same deal. If she's unmarried, she can operate freely. She can do the things of the Lord more freely. She's not as tied down with the responsibilities that you would have if you were married with children. Woe to them. Woe to them who are with child, to them who give suck in those days. Because why? There's going to be great distress in the land and a wrath upon this people. What's happening in this time? He's saying, I think it's good for the present distress. If you don't mind me suggesting, if you're single, you might want to stay single, right? If you're married, okay, stay married. Don't make any great alterations. Why? Because the end of how this world is operating in that Roman-Jewish war is around the corner. That's why. So as he continues, he says that she that is married cares for the things of the world. how she may please her husband. So same deal, right? Husband's married, God has to watch over the family, right? There's a huge priority there. If a woman is married, she has to please her husband and take care of her family. And that can make it very difficult to flee to the mountains and serve the ways of Christ in that present distress and that present time. And then he says this to confirm this position. And this I speak for your own profit. I'm not saying this to mess you up. That's why he says, not that I may cast a snare upon you. I'm not trying to mess you up. So I'm going to give that example again. If it was 1913 and you happen to be alive and you had a son or a daughter that wanted to get married, you might say, look, right now might not be the best deal because there's a lot of rumors and stuff about, a war. This is not a good time to make that move. You might want to wait this out a little bit. Do you see? And that's what Paul is saying. Why? Because the present distress that Jesus was saying was going to come upon them. He said that prophecy in Luke 21 around 30 AD, give or take, and they're in and around 55 to 60 AD. And he's like, look, all those things that Jesus was saying, yeah, they're coming to pass. So you might want to triple think this one. So the watchmen are out of business because it wasn't a commandment of the Lord. It was advice for the time frame. And that's the same kind of thing that's going on here when Jesus says, when Jerusalem is compassed with the armies, you know that the desolation is coming, so you're going to want to flee to the mountains. That's not advice for every day, right? You're not going to flee to the mountains every day, but he's saying that to them because it was a sign based on the question that they asked. What sign will there be when these things shall come to pass? And so one of those major signs that were towards the end was when Jerusalem will be compassed with armies. Then know that the desolation is near. And there's going to be great distress in that land and wrath upon that people. So you're going to want to flee to the mountains. All these prophecies came true in the first century. We're putting the watchmen and the watchwomen out of business so you can pour yourself into the greatest commandment. You can walk in love, peace, and joy. Love others as self. Well, all right, guys, there's my presentation. I know that a lot of folks may indeed be offended by this presentation. That's not my intention. That said, I do have to point out that oftentimes a lot of watchmen and watchwomen will talk about these dates and sometimes suggest that there's going to be something significant to happen, maybe even the rapture or something of this nature, or just something really big is going to happen on these days. And your attention, you're being distracted from these dates and from these watchmen and watchwomen, and you're paying attention to things that ultimately are never coming to pass, much like the weatherman that says there's an 80% chance it's going to rain, and then when it doesn't rain, they say, well, we told you 80%. Well, the watchmen and watchwomen oftentimes do these types of things. And the problem that I'm seeing with that is that it's taking your eyes of what the true will of God is for you. I can't tell you what it is, but I can tell you this much. If you're distracted with constant geopolitics and articles and online things that are happening in video articles or whatever it is, if you're constantly distracted with that, which, by the way, a little side note, you'll never know if that information is actually 100% accurate anyways, then to be quite direct, it's just going to distract you from what God has prepared for you. How can you focus on the will of God for you if you're constantly listening to watchmen and watchwomen tell you about these dates over and over again, and then nothing actually comes to pass? And in the meantime, you're not fulfilling the law of Christ. You're not focused on the opportunities that might be in front of you where you can do something really great right now, even if it's just for one person. So my suggestion is, my good brothers and sisters, that you stop paying attention to the watchmen and the watchwomen, and you start paying attention to the greatest commandment, love others as self, and start paying attention to the law of Christ, and start bearing one another's burdens. And in that, my good brothers and sisters, we can indeed make this world a better place. I hope this message finds you well. And in the meantime, remember, do all things with grace and peace.